All right, hi everybody, and welcome back. We're going to start with our concluding roundtable. I'm going to first, Michelle has asked to make a quick announcement, but it's also a wonderful occasion to thank Michelle for all the coordinating work she has done for this conference and the rest of the GLC staff. So thank you, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. This conference has been just incredible, and really appreciate all the presenters and all the audience members and all the discussion. I wanted to say a special thank you to Sarah Hopkins, who I think is back there. She's with the Macmillan Center. She's been providing just tremendous support throughout the planning and throughout the actual conference, and I just want to give her a shout out. And also Alexandra Caballero, one of the students who's been helping us, and Jude Pitty, and then, of course, all the GLC staff, Melissa McGrath, without whom none of us would be here, not on planet Earth, but here for the conference, and Deja Brabham, and Tamara Michelle, and Tom Thurston, who's back with the GLC for the time being. So thank you all.
All right, thanks everyone. Welcome back for our final panel. Again, not just a rich and phenomenal and wide-ranging conference, but I found myself after every panel with new insights, new questions, new possibilities. This is a concluding roundtable and a chance with a really diverse scholars coming from lots of different sites, bodies of experience, research expertise, a chance for us to take inventory of the past and think about the future. So we're going to do this in 2 rounds. One other thing I wanted to mention is for the folks in the room in New Haven, there's a wonderful exhibit at the New Haven Museum, Shining Light on Truth, that's about the New Haven, Yale, and slavery. It ends today at 5 p.m. It's free and it's 4 minutes away. So if at 3:30 you want to join us in walking over, please do so. And again, to thank, there's lots of folks watching online on the stream. We had a little glitch in it before, but to welcome them into the room as well. I'm going to do quick introductions and then begin our questions. So first to my right, from LA, and we're grateful, just take very seriously people that travel almost 3,000 miles and take time away from their work and their families and households to share their insights with us. So Terence is a professor with a split appointment in the Department of African American Studies and the UCLA Institute for Society and Genetics. Just want us to pause on that. Actually, half of Terence's appointment is in the social sciences and half is in the natural sciences. These are new kinds of configurations of appointments that are allowing people to do new kinds of work in terms of training, scholarship as well. He's written extensively about race, religion, law, medicine, and the life sciences. His award-winning first book, Divine Variations, which we'll have a chance to learn and think with, demonstrates how modern scientific theories of race are an extension of Christian intellectual history. So rather than imagining kind of faith and reason, empirical science as opposites, this work really shows us how they co-produce knowledge. And he has fascinating new work on in-custody deaths in jails from across the country based on lots of different methods, ethnography, community-based collaboration, data science, et cetera. Brandon Ogbunu is a computational biologist and an assistant professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology here at Yale. He's also a very active public writer and intellectual. You can find his work in The Atlantic, Scientific America, the Boston Review, among many other venues, writing on topics including Afrofuturism, the COVID-19 pandemic, bioethics, sports, and epidemiology. Again, I just want to say, lab work that we're going to learn about, but also a long practice and record of public scholarship as we think about how do we convey this. There's people that have long bodies of experience doing this. Many of you already had a chance to meet our just amazing new colleague. Although I have to say, Professor Nuriddin, it feels like you've been here forever in the best way, I mean that. Yes. Who is an assistant professor in our section on the history of medicine at the Yale School of Medicine. Professor Nuriddin is a historian of medicine and biology with particular interests in the histories of eugenics, racial science, scientific racism, reproduction, and human subjects research, and we'll get to hear more about that in our conversation today. Rana Hogarth, who we've heard in one of our opening panels yesterday, is an associate professor in the Department of History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Her work focuses on medical and scientific constructions of race during the era of slavery and beyond. And sometimes there's a joke about the many appointments people have, but it's not just something serially, it's part of people's political and intellectual and scholarly kind of biography and interventions that they're situated in these places. And finally, our colleague David Blight, the Sterling Professor of History at Yale and Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center, and the author, most recently, of Yale and Slavery that we'll be asking David to talk about. So welcome, everyone. So Terence, let's start with you. We have actually talked very little at this conference so far about the intersection of theology, religion, and race science. So I'm hoping we can start by asking you to talk a little bit about Divine Variations. You have a new co-edited volume, Critical Approaches to Science and Religion, that speak about why it's important to center theological frameworks, genealogies, traditions in interrogating these histories.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you all for all the organizers in this panel, this conversation. These sets of discussions we've been having have just been really just brilliant and important, and we need them. So one thing that I want everyone to think about is when you imagine race, I think what we often forget is that at its core, race is about belief. And that's true from the natural sciences to the law to politics. So to inhabit a world where you think someone's skin or their complexion or their height or their intellectual ability tells you something that's innate and permanent and enduring, without realizing it, is reproducing a very old way of looking at the world. A way of looking at the world that certainly for the West has been shaped by Christian thinking or the traditions that come out of the Abrahamic faith tradition, so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And we often forget this because when we tell the story of the history of scientific racism, it's very easy to start at the Enlightenment, reason, empirical methods, or we can start with like the emergence of modern technological science and biology. But what we forget is that for several centuries, the West has framed human origins using foundational creation narratives that we have not emancipated ourselves from, despite our effort to be rational, to be secular, to think that we have sort of abandoned the past. We haven't. It's very much embedded in the way that we think of human diversity and human difference. And so my first book, this is what I explored. I tried to show the direct connections between early Christian thinking, early modern Christian thinking, and the emergence of ideas around common human ancestry, or ideas around the persistence of racial traits over time. All of these things occupy a kind of philosophical and theological worldview that we think is in the past, and it really, really isn't. So we can find this in genetic science and technologies, where we are still committed to this notion humans all share a common ancestor, which is a genetic truth. But there have been cultures and populations for centuries that have lived and thrived without this knowledge. There are indigenous communities that are not committed to telling a comprehensive worldview that gives an account of where everyone's origins come from. We in the West, particularly those of us that come from these Abrahamic faith traditions, we're obsessed with this idea. It's a very important idea. And it cuts in all these very fascinating directions that are really, really important. So faith and belief is a crucial component to thinking about race and thinking about science. Audrey Smedley is another person who I wanted to sort of invoke here because she's someone who has been very foundational for all of us who think about scientific racism. She said very long time ago, the race concept in Europe and America is a cosmological ordering system, which is to say, it gives you a way to place people that you encounter in the world. You place them in terms of their ancestry. You place them in terms of their susceptibility to disease or their intellectual ability. It's a very powerful organizing force and device. So much so that in my work I began to realize we could study scientific racism like a religion, which is to say that it's something that gets passed along, it gets embedded into law, it gets embedded into politics, it gets embedded into everyday common sense conversations, which is, to think back to earlier conversations, the power of the eugenics movement is precisely because it activates, I think, these older sensibilities we have that are rooted in a desire to create order and continuity in the world that we inhabit. And race and religion have been very powerful forces to do this. The work that I've done since then, thinking about the connection between science and religion, has been really trying to give us a new set of vocabularies, a new set of commitments to think about these two connections that I think in our current moment are becoming much more obvious with the rise of the religious right, the rise of a return to the eugenics movement, the sort of movement of genetic science further and further towards the right, which we saw in our earlier panel. These things are not accidental. I think there's a deep connection between the Christian religious traditions that have shaped America in particular and our commitment to a kind of racial worldview. So these are the things that for me have been really, really important for my scholarship.
What really stands out for me, Terence, there's ways that we teach histories of scientific discovery that are these like neatly delineated temporal paradigms. So this was the high period of Mendelian genetics, and then it was replaced by the synthesis, and then there. And part of what you're saying is what gets missed there is a whole underlying interpretive framework that far predates it. And like ideological interpretation doesn't work like that, where everyone says we're turning in these old ways and completely subscribing to a new sense. So that's so helpful to think about. Brandon, I want to turn to you now, and first in a couple of minutes to help us get our heads around the work you do in your lab. What does it mean to be a computational biologist? And then how that connects to the public-facing work you do, and what are the strands that we should think about in doing kind of both basic research and it's kind of helping the public to understand the context in which that research is done.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you, Professor Keel, for your comments. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this. This is really, really a thrill. I was joking with Carl Zimmer earlier that the fun thing about being in this environment is oftentimes I'm on this panel in population and quantitative genetic audiences, and I'm the humanist, right? They're like, who is this Du Bois person you're talking about? And in this panel, of course, I get to kind of do the standard day job craft, which is exciting for me. And in light of that, I'll try to be brief because I want to hear from the rest of these giants, who I don't get a chance to talk with at this level. So I think I would describe my work this way. It's kind of dominated by a tension, okay? So my classical training in population and evolutionary and mathematical genetics has trained me to think about, the notion that DNA is one of the most powerful parcels of information in the universe. And I'll defend that, right? It teaches me how to understand it, why it's important, the way variation in it influences all aspects of what life is. And I will defend that, right? To a point, right? And I think in my technical training, as I've attempted to think about, two main problems I think about are kind of population genetic problems and epidemiological problems, are the two sorts of complex biological problems that I think about in my laboratory. The point is to get them right. I actually want the proper tools to be able to predict and understand the way epidemics are spreading within a set of populations. I actually do want to understand what the population genetic and the forces that underlie type 2 diabetes. I want to understand kind of what was happening at the mutational level as SARS-CoV-2 was evolving. And I think this formal technical lens has given us incredible insight to the way it works. But also, we're getting a lot of things technically wrong. Genomic prediction, hasn't delivered on its promise. Personalized medicine hasn't delivered on its promise. I think superheroes did remarkable things during the pandemic, but they also got things shockingly and embarrassingly wrong, okay? So when you think about the things that we were getting wrong, part of that is because the laws that we've developed that have been kind of this path dependence from Mendel, and on up and down, right? Are kind of informed by this physics envy, right? This notion that we're going to find a set of discrete laws to describe everything. And when I describe the tension, it has been, I've learned that, the way to learn why those are wrong, what are the things that we're getting wrong, how do we actually make them technically better, lives in theology and in history and in sociology, and in black studies, and the history of science, right? So that literature, right, now that's become an interest of my own, right? And now I kind of think about and try to animate my work on my own. But like I said, I can't possibly do it at the level of the individuals on this panel, but nonetheless, not only is its own kind of direction for me in my research program, it now directly informs the technical work that I'm thinking about in my laboratory. Okay, so now we, for example, I'm developing mathematical properties that can consider how epidemics spread in unequal societies, for example, right? Which is kind of should have been foundational, right? It's like only now we're beginning to think about this sort of heterogeneity, the notion of gene by environment interactions, which has been around in Carl's book. It's articulated very, very well. It's been around a long, long time. We've known this for a very, very long time, but just how powerful a crafter it is in thinking about why one population gets type 2 diabetes and the other. That's rooted in history, that's rooted in access, that's rooted in these social forces that people of my pedigree are not trained to understand. Okay, so I think that's been the fun, that's been the challenge, that is where the opportunity to intersect with this sorts of scholarship is. And I think anytime my department chair says, why are you doing this? It's because I'm trying to get the day job right. Yeah. Right, and so that's kind of how I would outline where my work.
Yeah. You know, there's the metaphor of like the white coat that the researcher puts on that pulls that person out of social relations, so it's just them and their data, make predictions, and it's authority comes from that, right? I've risen above that, so I can make sober, right? And you're saying not only is that not wrong, it leads to bad outcomes because the work itself takes place in a context that you're obligated to understand. And I mean, to your point, Brandon, you don't actually have to go back and get a second PhD to do it. You can be curious and read and learn. You can just learn laterally, yeah. And you also don't need approval. It doesn't have to be written into precisely what you're given. So thanks, and we look forward to hearing like where the work is going next. I wanted to turn to you now. So some of your new teaching and research and work is on new conceptualizations of medical ethics, research standards, and medical mistrust. And your appointment also allows you to do some work in clinical settings and training, some with undergraduate and graduate students in history. So what does that work look like for you now, and what led you to these questions?
So thanks so much for that question. I just want to say how much I fangirl everybody on the panel and how exciting this is. So what the sort of origin story for my interest in things like medical mistrust and human subjects research, I can really trace to my grandma, who one of my friends used to say that your grandma is like haunting your research. Because my mom's family is all from Baltimore, and my grandma used to tell us growing up, and other relatives as well, used to tell us, don't walk past Hopkins at night because you're gonna get snatched up for experiments. And I used to be like, okay, Nana, doing the most right now. But then once I became a historian of medicine, I realized the power of statements like that, right? And why so many people believed that growing up without questioning it. Nobody said like, well, that's weird that who would grab people off the side like that. It was just like, no, Hopkins definitely does this, and nobody questioned it. And then I went to Hopkins and got my PhD, and I was like, Nana might have been onto something. But so that's kind of the genesis, and then also another sort of really important turning point for me in thinking about why we need to really take seriously histories of medical mistrust is the ways that during the COVID pandemic and people were talking about skepticism around the COVID vaccine, that people would say, oh, well, black people aren't getting the vaccine because of Tuskegee. And I was like, well, actually, black people aren't getting the vaccine for a whole cornucopia of reasons, but also because of histories of things that happened before, during, and after Tuskegee, right? And the ways in which we reduce medical violence to that moment, right? And saying, okay, well, this is a blip on the screen, and what we fixed it. You know, we had the Belmont report, we have bioethics now, problem solved, and recognizing how insufficient that narrative was. So one of the things I do, I started teaching this course as a postdoc, and I now teach it here, a course called Beyond Tuskegee, that traces the histories of race and human subjects research. We start with the history of slavery and basically work our way to last Tuesday, right? And we scratch the surface. We don't even get to every example because there's so many histories, because racism, as we've been discovering, you know, talking about all weekend, is baked into the premise of biomedical research. And that biomedical research happens through the exploitation of Black and brown people and otherwise marginalized people, right? That if you look at all kinds of biomedical research across the 20th century, it's Black people, it is people with disabilities, it is people who are poor, it is people who are incarcerated. These are the targets of the research. It's never the wealthy, the elite, et cetera. Thank you, Jason, keeping it real. And like, that history is something I feel like is really important, not only for historians of science and medicine to contend with, because these are narratives that are also reified in some of our work as well, but also in the ways that clinicians and other folks doing biomedical research study these things. And so one of the origin story of the Beyond Tuskegee course actually started as a graduate student when I had to, as part of research I did, have to go through IRB approval. You know, those like online training modules you have to do as part of the IRB, or the Institutional Review Board training. And there's always a little history section, and it'll say, okay, well, Nazis were terrible, and then we had Tuskegee, but now everything's fine. And I found those infuriating. And so I was like, and so as a historian, of course, when I'm angry, I channel everything into making a syllabus. And so I developed this course as a graduate student. I've taught a few different flavors of it, and I taught it this fall to think critically about not only where does medical mistrust come from, but also for us to think about why does exploitation and extraction have to continue to be a fundamental part of how we do scientific and medical research, right? What if we imagined new ways of doing this research that didn't rely on the same forms of extraction that we historicize, right, in our work? And so another angle of a project that I'm hoping to get started once the book is done, I promise, is as part of the community history lab that I co-direct with Professor Marco Ramos, we're hoping to build a project around medical mistrust specifically at Yale and in New Haven. And what are the ways that people experience medical care at this institution or refuse to participate in medical care at this institution? And what does this tell us about local history, but what does it also tell us about current research practice, and what does it tell us about current politics? And one of the things that I think is really important and will hopefully be a centerpiece of this project is not just sort of documenting these people don't trust this, but also thinking about the ways that we can learn from community to make Yale a trustworthy institution, right? Because sometimes when we talk about medical mistrust, that is always put on the people who are experiencing it. We're like, they mistrust, so if we fix them, then they will trust. But the combination needs to be, they mistrust, what do we need to do? Right, and we're hoping that that'll be a focal point of the project, and thinking about not sort of reimagining things like what informed consent looks like when you take this history into consideration, or building from or being in conversation the work of folks like Ruha Benjamin who talk about ideas of informed refusal. Right, what does that mean to do that in an academic medical center? And so these are all sort of this project is still very preliminary, so we're still getting our arms around it. But I wanted to bring this up because there's so many different sort of instantiations of this mistrust, and that also we think of mistrust as something that only sort of people of certain backgrounds experience. But I think, as we'll see, which is becoming very clear with current political discourse, that mistrust exists on the far right as well, and that all of these things about dismantling science also come from places of mistrust, right, and distrust, and some of it is justified, and how do we contend with that as well?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that last point you're making, which is like, one might think on first blush, oh, this is a nice add-on to week 13 in a medical ethics class. You're saying, if we don't get this right, the whole public consent around all the work we do is in danger, and part of it is in danger for reasons that we have to acknowledge. And I'm also just struck by the way in the first three panels, we're getting very clear, like, this is the dominant framework, right? You're a student of your own discipline, right? This is what's, historians are getting wrong about this. This is what happens in computational genomics, that's something missing. This is what happens in ethics trainings courses that are missing. So attention to the dominant, so you can imagine something else, right? You have to know it really, really well. Rana, I want to take that to turn to you. So you've had this career that's brought you, Yale's History of Medicine program, you've been at Hopkins, you're now at Penn. Those are, historically many of the leading institutions that are producing scholars, historians, clinicians, researchers in this work, to reflect a little bit on both changes you've seen across the kind of span of your career and where you kind of think things are now, especially in terms of like training, research frameworks, et cetera.
Okay, so thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be on the panel, sort of a last minute addition, but I really appreciate this question, Dan. So here's what I will say. Okay, I want to kind of address a couple of things because I think it is a bit weird that I have been able to be in these really wonderful spaces to do the work that I do. I've often kind of been the only one of me doing that kind of work. And so that's just like a real reality. And I wanted to kind of flag that because I think in some ways I was quite actually lucky to be here in starting the work that I was doing in history of medicine. I had wonderful faculty members who would kind of encourage me when I was questioning ideas about race and difference. And I kind of was, I was given a copy of Todd Savitt's work on medicine and medicine and slavery, like looking at Virginia. And it was like 1984 or 81, like it's an old book. But I was given this book and I kind of read through it and it made me super curious. And it also made me realize something about how we tell stories, right? I kind of felt like there's a lot of history of medicine, a lot of history of science, but I'm like, this is a history of slavery. And something that I have found in my experience kind of going through these distinctive institutions, and also teaching at a larger state school where I taught a US history survey course and an African American history survey course, was that every time I was teaching those big survey courses, I was like, this is actually informing the ways that I'm thinking about my work in race and medicine, particularly the role of slavery, and particularly thinking about how can I get these fields to speak to each other, because I think that's actually quite significant. I think that for history of medicine, when we think about training, we go to archives, we read, the specific kinds of texts, and that's wonderful. But something that I've always thought about, and what I actually talk to graduate students about now, is sort of this idea of a doctor-patient relationship between an enslaved person and a physician is a very specific kind of relationship. And it's one that requires a very specific kind of archival gaze, because you're looking at a specific kind of asymmetry. You're looking at silences. You're looking at power. You're looking at resistance, noncompliance. And to be able to carefully sit and sort of work through some of the very upsetting things that you will find in an archive or in printed and published treatises by respected doctors, I think you have to kind of get a little bit from these different disciplines. And I actually try to use the history of slavery to ground myself when I'm thinking about some of the medical sources that I encounter, particularly the idea of sort of how race can be read, how race is kind of legible, the idea of centering enslaved Black women's bodies. So I'm constantly looking at Jennifer Morgan's work, but I'm also reading Charlotte Fett's work or Chris Willoughby's work, other historians of medicine and historians of slavery. And so for me, what I've actually seen that's something that's, I think, quite wonderful is that when I started going to conferences for history of medicine, I'm not gonna tell you when, because I don't wanna date myself too much, but it was a while. I'm telling you, this gray hair is not for show. And so I would say that, no, it's true. There were not always that many panels about race in medicine. And then it was okay, the race and medicine panels are on Sunday morning. And then it's okay, there's 2 race and medicine. Yes. And then the race and medicine panels started growing. And then there were multiple race and medicine. And then there was oh, we're asking these different questions. This is one on slavery. This is one in the 20th century. And then it got to the point where I started noticing that my colleagues that were attending the conferences, I was not the only one of me in a room, which was also really exciting. And then it got to the point of now us being annoyed of but I want to go to one of these panels. There's 3 panels that are addressing race and science and inequity and medicine at the same time. And all of my friends are on them. And which friend can I go and support in the audience? So now I have to run in between the different panels. So that is that's probably the only hopeful thing you'll probably hear from me, because I'm super cynical, but that is a true thing that I can at least tell you that I have witnessed in my time doing this job, having the privilege of doing this kind of a job. So I think that I would encourage, just as we are talking about kind of cross-pollination involving sort of, biological sciences, whatever terms that people are, hard sciences, I think that we need to be talking to each other. And just within the discipline of history, I find myself seeing more and more folks who are like, I'm interested in history of medicine, but I have like this training in like history of slavery, or I have this training thinking specifically about women's history or thinking about gender studies. I'm sort of like, yes, you are actually all part of this conversation. So I think that's like the direction we ought to be heading in.
Thanks, Rana. That point you make in the beginning about I was the only one, I like all of you have spoke to that as well. But then moving from the conditions where you're the only one to that not being the case, and one has to like take care of themselves when you're the only one and doing it, but also thinking about what are the structures that will ensure that other people are drawn into the work that all of you have done. David, let's turn to you to wrap up this first round. So Yale and slavery came out recently. Science wasn't, an overarching theme, but early in its history, Yale conceptualized and imagined itself as a source of scientific knowledge production in addition to its work in the humanities, arts, et cetera. Benjamin Silliman is one figure in particular that you take up in the book. So I wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about science in this project, the archives you engaged, et cetera, and what we might learn from it.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for being so organized about moderating. This is not always, the roundtable at the end is not always so organized. This is good. I assume we'll come back for a few other comments because I've been taking notes for 2 days here, so warning you. Rana, it's okay that you've become a little bit slavery determinist. Why not? Some of us do that around here. Yeah, we published this a year ago. The paperback just came out this week, which is a sign that it actually has sold. Amazing, isn't it? Dan asked me to say a few words about Benjamin Silliman, just as a place to plant ourselves here. Silliman was, came to Yale in the 1790s. I think he graduated in 1796. He came from the largest slaveholding family in Connecticut. The story is his mother sold 2 people to pay his tuition. That's always had a little mythical ring to it, but Joy tells me it's true. I just borrowed my friend Joy Burns, who was part of our working group, representing both local history, public history, and the community. But I noticed her at lunch, she had a copy of this. I said, Dan just told me I got to talk about Silliman. Can I borrow the book? So I've taken 2 minutes here to read up on what I wrote about Benjamin Silliman. Anyway, to cut to the chase, Silliman gets hired here, I think only 3 years after he's graduated. He was the first ever professor of chemistry and natural history. He is responsible in many ways for bringing science into university curriculums. He managed to negotiate with rich people for the Perkins cabinet, the Gibbs cabinet, these incredible, massive cabinets of minerals, some of which you can still see over at the Peabody. One of them was the Gibbs cabinet, owned by a George Gibbs in Newport, Connecticut, whose family was big into the slave trade. And they collected these minerals all over the world. Silliman was John C. Calhoun's tutor when Calhoun was an undergraduate here, et cetera, et cetera. But in Silliman's career, many things happened. He was at Yale more than 50 years on the faculty. Doesn't die until he's here till the eve of the Civil War. Among the many, many research projects he did, and he traveled the world lecturing, by the way, was a project he got a federal grant for. There were federal grants in the 1830s. He got it directly from the White House. Andrew Jackson, whom he'd befriended back in 1821, that Andrew Jackson. And he just asked him, I need money for a study of sugar production in Louisiana. Jackson said, here, how much you need? And Silliman, by the way, was amazing at getting everybody to give him money. That's one of the things I learned about him. So he gets this massive grant, several $1,000s, which in the 1830s was a lot of iron. And he took a team to Louisiana for parts of 2 years to study sugar production. Because at this point, there was a lot of interest in how sugar was going to come to maybe compete with cotton as the big new crop, the big new industry. And it was, although it never kind of overtook cotton from the American South. And he had a colleague, also a professor of chemistry and natural science here, named Charles Upham Shepard. And when he gave instructions to Shepard as to how to manage this project in Louisiana, he said to him, and I remember when Hope McGrath, our head researcher on this project, without whom this would never have happened, she found this quote. And when she showed it to me, I said, oh my God, that's the epigraph for the book, because it reads, open your eyes and ears to every fact connected with the actual condition of slavery everywhere, but do not talk about it. Hear and see everything, but say little. Now, all of us, the group of us working on this at the time, I remember who said it first, but that could be a motto of Yale University in the first half of the 19th century, maybe the whole of the 19th century. Yale became sort of famous for its raging moderation on all issues. And I don't say that with contempt. It evolved here in theology, in the sciences, in approaches to history, in politics. By the 1840s and 1850s, you had people here at Yale on all sides of the slavery issue. It was one of the most fascinating things about doing the book to me, to learn about just the range of Yale people, some from the South, a lot of them from the South. At any rate, Silliman is this giant of science with a checkered record. There's a big statue of him right over on Science Hill. Big statue. It was behind a whole bunch of construction for the last several years. It's now been, it's kind of open to the sky again. There he stands. At the unveiling of that statue in 1884, which is, God knows, 20-some years after he died, the person who pulled the cord to unveil it was one Robert Park. Robert Park was a black man from New Haven who for decades served as Silliman's research assistant. Silliman used to call him his sub-professor. Now, Robert Park had no position, we couldn't find out, we couldn't find out how much he got paid by Professor Silliman, but Robert Park traveled everywhere with Silliman. Every time he would do experiments for public audiences, Park was there to do it. And Park became part of Silliman's story, and Park's family became part of Yale's story, and that's, as they say, another story. I have no opinion on what Yale ought to do about the memory of Benjamin Silliman, except you can read about 15 pages about him in our book. Start there.
Thanks, David. I mean, part of what also really stands out for me there is, we have this new discourses about the politicization of science as if it's a new phenomenon that, but here, just saying in that stark language, the founder of science education attended Yale, based on profits from the slavery. And I mean, imagine opening up a chemistry class saying that, right? We're going to study the principles and characteristics of molecules, and we want to understand why you have to understand another history to be able to do that. So I'm grateful for that. We're going to do into a second round and then open it up for questions, and this is really about your current and future work. And I think I want to start here with you. I may move it around a little bit, Terence, to ask you to talk about some of the interdisciplinary work you're doing at UCLA, the opportunities you see for historians to work in collaboration with clinical bench researchers, et cetera, what you've kind of learned from that and where you think it needs to go.
Sure. When I finished my first book, what became very clear to me, as it often happens when you're writing a book, you get these insights at the very end of it all that you wish you had said in a more clear-throated way, but then it becomes the genesis of the next project. living in the West where religion shapes your worldview creates a kind of fatalism in that if race is tied to nature or God, pick or choose, they're the same, then why bother changing social structure? If the habits, the life expectancy, the intelligence, the morality of people is determined by some divine being or some natural force, why have democracy? Why have political equality? Why even study human social structures? Because human social structures don't matter, right? But if you look at the history of evolutionary biology and genetics, that is precisely what has happened. This idea that you can isolate genetic factors independent of the social political environment under which those genes turn on or off, et cetera, we have become incapable of looking at the human social structures that create shortened life expectancy, that create inequality. But more than that, I think we have become a people that don't build institutions of care, because that's what social structures are, care, whether it's mental health treatment, free access to healthcare, competent healthcare. These are vital things that make the difference between living older than 65 or 67, which is roughly the expected life expectancy of African American men, and not, right? And so in this next work, I really wanted to, as a scholar, measure, study, encounter the lack of social structures. What happens when this occurs? And for me, it really was a turning point watching the public murder of George Floyd, right? And the fact that we all who witnessed that murder saw very clearly it was Derek Chauvin. He killed this person. He killed George Floyd. But then to read his autopsy, and for the autopsy to say, by quoting this, cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement subdual. That's literally what it says on George Floyd's autopsy. In other words, George Floyd's bad heart is the reason why law enforcement had to use excessive force to subdue him. In other words, his bad genes, his bad biology is what ended his life, not the social political structure of policing and over-policing, not the economic inequalities in that region of Minneapolis, right? So George Floyd's death puts on in a very brilliant and tragic display what happens when we as a society can't see social structure. We just see raw, pure biology. So this became the genesis of a lab and a research question. How many more George Floyds are there? How many more Breonna Taylors are there? How many more Sandra Blands are there? Turns out there are a lot of them, and they all are not Black or Latino. Every segment of American society is dying in custody. But worse still, the medical examiners and the coroners are reading these bodies, and they're extracting out of their reports the social, political, economic structures that we are responsible for ending those lives. And so what I've done is 5 years ago, founded a lab with a bunch of brilliant undergraduate researchers. One of them is in this room right now, Yu Ching, who's now a first-year medical school student here at Yale, where we give her a applause. No, I mean, honestly, I think that it's the bright, ambitious, courageous young minds that help you get over the cynicism and the nihilism of seeing the violence of what we are as a nation state, honestly. So what we started doing is we started creating FOIA requests to gather the autopsies of people who've died in custody. We've now gathered around 3,000 autopsies of people who've died in custody between 2000 and 2020. We've developed a complex research data protocol to analyze those records, and we turn those records into data points. The most important part of this process is it started with working with community that was impacted by in-custody death. I learned how to read an autopsy from a woman, Helen Jones, who lost her son in custody, who died in solitary confinement, and law enforcement said that he hung himself, except that he had a broken nose, and he had lacerations all over his body, and that he had recent physical trauma that would have been impossible to have if you were in solitary confinement. And so she taught herself how to read an autopsy with medical books, anatomy books, talking to other community members, brought me into that process. And together we created an entire research profile of how to analyze any autopsy record with the kinds of questions that community on the ground need. And so this has become something that we've done in multiple cities. We're working in LA, we're working in Pennsylvania, we're working in Maryland. We've written white papers and reports. We've drafted a law in the state of Maryland that was passed just last year. And now it's become a book. So there's a book that's coming out in later this fall called The Coroner's Silence that tries to sort of tell a humane story about people who perish in custody, our accountability for these losses, and how we need new type of scholarship to actually expose these things. Because I think in many ways, to do this work, we're not actually incentivizing young scholars and young minds to do this, right? It's something that's foreign to the way that we think about the university, and I think that comes at our detriment. And I think many of the comments that you all were sharing a little bit earlier, we see the consequences of what happens when we're training people in ways where they can't see the social structures that are determining their own life chances.
I mean, well, just first, what an amazing project and the book that we can all look forward to, but it's also like you're calling our attention, like there's the initial moment of violence that results, that takes George Floyd's life, but then there's subsequent violence that happens within the institutions, within the very process and frameworks of knowledge production that do something else to it. And that is also important to understand in that sense. It participates in a circuit. So thanks, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Brandon, let's turn to you about, and I'm also curious about, you know, since Terence mentioned this, like labs as, they're not just sites to reproduce formal competencies, how to look at data sets, et cetera, but to inculcate and shape and provide and reproduce frameworks to interpret the world around. So yeah, what's kind of next in your lab and work, and how do you think about that training question that Terence also raised?
Yeah, no, great question. You know, part of what this is about is like, how do I animate these contexts in the technical science that is happening in the laboratory, right? It's one thing to kind of write about them and talk with you all about them, but how do we actually take these ideas and formalize them to improve the technical, computational, and mathematical and genetic things that are happening? And that's kind of where we think about it. I think I'll start with kind of a obvious but large problem, and I'll kind of march way through some other things that we're thinking about. Just the term population genetics, okay, right? If you ask any of my colleagues what a population actually is, right, it's a deeply dubious and conflicted and contradictory and inconsistent, and capricious notion, right? And we mean different things within different subfields of the same field, right? So when we're thinking about, and race, of course, is the heavyweight champion of all of those problems, right? But even that, we continue to struggle, even if I'm not malintended, even if I actually am trying to understand why a disease is especially prevalent in a population, right? I'm not really sure what I mean, right? And I don't know the baggage that that's carrying, right? In that way. And I don't pretend there's an easy solution for that problem, right? But it is a dialogue that needs to have that is absolutely in conversation here, right? So and to the field's credit, I think now when we, even in some of these large scale studies, there is kind of appendices where they actually try to address some of this, or at least give it some kind of oxygen in a way that they once did not, right? So we try to have those kind of conversations in the laboratory. I published a paper on prisons and COVID, right? And we had in the appendix a very clear discussion reference that was scholarly about what we mean by Black incarcerated population, right? So that's a formalism that we work into the way we think about data science. I said that was obvious, but it's kind of in some ways not. But I think there's subtler ways that we kind of try to think about this sort of work. Let's go to like something a little bit kind of off to the side, right? Everybody's heard of the human microbiota, right? The microbiome. And it's one of the most, again, there's a theme, right? Very, very, very exciting direction, missing some things, right? So the human microbiota, really, really one of the triumphant discoveries kind of the last, when you think about the discovery date, at least the last quarter century. And again, has potential to transform life. I don't have to do the sales pitch anymore. I think you understand this is how I'm trained. But like a lot of subfields, like psychology and cancer biology and a lot of kind of subfields, it is suffering from a replicability crisis, okay? We are unable, right? Remember when kombucha was supposed to cure depression and all that? Right? Weird, right? There was, and companies have fallen flat trying to animate this into therapies, and it does not work. And then recently I saw a short paper in, I believe it was in Nature Medicine, like, oh, wow, big discovery here, or here's a big thought, that the human microbiota is a dynamic thing that changes through the day. Nobody actually thought. We've known about how microbiota, I mean, that's the most obvious thing. You don't need to be Terence Keel to understand that. You just need to understand some basic things about how biological processes work. And yet we've generated an entire research paradigm, right, around a flat and one-dimensional understanding, right, about. So what we are a laboratory that thinks very carefully about when you think about the effects of a gene, which again, take BRCA1 and 2, take, right, a lot of, they are individual genes that do powerful things in human beings, and we should acknowledge that and understand that. Part of the reason why we call it BRCA1 or 2 is we have named it after breast cancer when 90% of breast cancer is not related to BRCA1 or 2. Right? So the idea here is, right, we kind of empowered these concepts with this weight, and we have not considered how context. We try to work that in. We study gene by environment interactions formally. We develop methods to study those in populations. We develop mathematical models to think about heterogeneity in populations. We animate that formally, right? And I think those are kind of some of the examples of the things that we do in the laboratory. Now, how do I do that? How does this manifest in training? Well, I'm starting to attract a kind of eclectic bent arrow group of people who kind of think that way, right? So I would love to say that I'm doing the training. I think they're training themselves. But I think I do have some things where, for example, in the dissertations, everyone has to have a extra chapter that is exploratory and collaborative. That's almost like, it's not like a hard requirement. I can't get away with that at Yale. But it's like an informal expectation. And those can be collaborative, those can be off the center, and oftentimes those do involve this sort of work interfacing with society. I have a student studying evolvability, which is a kind of a hipster evolutionary theory concept. But she's a co-author on the mathematical stuff about inequalities. Right? And so she's kind of learning this vocabulary, and hopefully she can take this with her through her career.
Thanks. I mean, that's just such a vivid and specific account of how this work can be done and reproduced. And I'm also struck between the two, this idea that a discipline in a field is subject to a certain object of study that's constituted a naturalistic entity. So a microbe is fixed, or the body as the site, and you're both saying that's not right. That's not, that's not what we're trying to study. You need to study something else to understand that as well. I'm going to actually ask you to conclude us. You've also been here. Well, you've been here across the whole conference also, so you'll be a certain way to kind of offer the last comment before we turn. So I want to see Rana or David invite one of you to go where we're going from here, where your work is taking, and then we'll conclude with Ayah. Yeah. Do you want to do it?
Okay, so I will say a little bit about where my work is going, and I'm going to try and connect like the very deeply nerdy historian part of myself to things that are maybe perhaps more relevant to folks. So just to be completely transparent, this second project was actually a graduate paper that I wrote when I was here in grad school that had lain fallow for a while, but it was actually a genuinely interesting paper to me. That was the idea of race crossing. I had been I kind of will forever kind of live in the 18th century and thinking about 18th century constructions of race. But I was also like, okay, there's also change over time. And how do people think about race? It just doesn't stay still. And I remember thinking about, ideas about, oh, black people are susceptible to this disease and not this disease. And I think I had a genuine question of like, wait, but what about people who are black and white? What about people who are mixed race? And in sort of doing this work for this graduate seminar, I stumbled upon like Davenport and race crossing studies. I was like in my 20s, so I didn't realize that somebody could actually publish something on race crossing. It was like this giant tome, like a phone book. A phone book is like a big thing that used to have phone numbers in it, and they would drop it at your doorstep. Sorry. The yellow, exactly, that sort of a thing. This huge study, and I'm like, how did somebody get away with this? And that was sort of a graduate seminar research paper, but then I started to dig in deeper, and I realized that that was actually just a snapshot of what a eugenicist was doing to try and understand racial traits and features, et cetera. And I realized where is the vocabulary, and where is the logic for this? Where are the assumptions? They're baked into Davenport and other eugenicists' ideas about bodies and race, and that's coming from the slavery era. And I realized, okay, it's time to dig even deeper, and that has sort of led me to trying to disrupt traditional histories of eugenics that focus on the scientists, that focus on, like Galton, that focus on this as a kind of reactionary science to, oh, in the 20th century, the immigrant population of the United States changed. And I'm like, that is all true, and there's certainly this concern, but black people had been around for a while, and they were certainly in the eyes of eugenicists, that they sort of, their gaze attracted eugenicists. To the point of disrupting that kind of historiography, I also thought about just the day-to-day ways in which people think that they can read race, like this idea of legibility. Davenport measured mixed race people, like he had field workers go in, have people roll up their arms, like just like mixed race people, and have a color top spun to detect the gradations and percentages of black and white and yellow and red that they could read into skin. Now, we're not doing that, but I know that there are people in sort of the more informal settings who think, well, I can tell if that person, what race they are, or people might say, this person's ambiguously raced, or you could be a member of the royal family and be like, what color will Archie be? And you can be a person that says, oh, let's do a documentary about hair. Let's police hair. Let's talk about hair texture. Let's talk about how that's a giveaway. And for me, that's sort of that everyday part of life that helps to animate why I am digging into eugenicists who collected hair samples from mixed race people, who came up with a vocabulary of precision that they sort of masquerade as like, this is science, this is precision. But then I look back at Edward Long, as I addressed in my talk on Friday, who is basically already commenting on, oh, this is the curl and shape of, quote, mulatto hair. So the work that I'm doing is kind of melding together these concerns about sort of the precision of science and sort of the narratives we have about precision of science, and the idea that we can quantify races and quantify who we are. I think of those like terrible ancestry commercials where people are like, I'm this % German, I'm this % that, as if that you can percentagize that, and then therefore that then has this major impact on, like, you know, if you decide to wear lederhosen. It's just a terrible ad. But anyway, the point is that those kinds of questions, those are like everyday questions that people, like I have still met people who say, well, so on this side, I'm this % this, and on my dad's side, I'm this % that. And they are being completely honest and genuine and real in saying that. But we are saying that as if that's not problematic. It's just been accepted and assumed. And I'm looking at like what eugenicists are doing, where they're saying this person is this % black and this % white, and this is why we can read that and see that. And I'm not convinced that we aren't still doing that in another form right now. So that's kind of where I am currently with what I'm doing.
And I just want to say that, you know, it's a historical project, but it connects so much to what Brandon was talking about, which is, well, what are the common sense ways that population is constituted, by what criteria, right? And the reference are always going to be back to those historical paradigms. So you have to look back to figure out even the mathematics, right, about how you're making those decisions as well. Otherwise, you're all just reproducing, you know, 18th century race science, even if you were directed to do so. David, let's turn to you.
Oh, well, Brandon, I never have to worry about whether I'm the humanist on a panel. I don't have that identity crisis. I left chemistry in the 11th grade and not in good standing. Terence, I want to go back to Terence's notion here of belief. Religion, whatever, you know, however we want to call this. A quick anecdote. It's got to be at least 25 years ago. I was at a conference at the German Historical Institute in Washington. Don't chuckle. They did some of the most progressive things I've ever attended. This was all funded by the then German government. It was a Cold War thing, you know. It was their version of a tiny little Fulbright program. But anyway, it was the idea of race was the conference. 2 days, all kinds of the coolest scholars. The opening session was, as I recall anyway, and don't trust your memory, but it was a group of young, hotshot, really smart scholars from anthropology and other fields making, all three of them, making the argument, race is a social construction. Remember, some of us who are old enough, that was everywhere for a while. If you didn't use social construction in every other sentence, you, you weren't welcome, right? Social construction, social construction. Of course race doesn't exist. The commentator was none other than Sidney Mintz. Now, some in this room, I hope, will remember who Sid Mintz was, one of the greatest anthropologists that did so much to help us understand the syncretism of African cultures into the Caribbean and the New World. And Mintz and Price used to be the book everyone had to teach. Sid got up in his beautiful, gentlemanly, graceful way, and he said, oh, this was brilliant, this was fascinating. He said, the problem is, everyone walking on the street out there here in Washington doesn't believe that. And then he went from there to basically remind us, of course race is a social construction, but what if it doesn't matter outside the door, outside there? Even educated people out there, I remember him saying, they don't believe it either. So what are we going to do about that? I don't know where the conference went from there, but that's what I remember about that conference. A few quick thoughts here from, I'm not going to talk about my own work here. I'm doing a new biography of James Weldon Johnson, and just hang in there for a few years, it'll be out. An amazing, amazing, amazing American figure. First of all, baked in. I've been hearing baked in, normalizing, the embeddedness of this problem over the whole 2 days. It's certainly a take-home idea. Why is the biology of race so baked in to human understandings of what and who we are, whereas you could point to some other elements of knowledge, other things we know about ourselves that have not remained as baked in? I think that we have to keep thinking about that, especially in the way we teach. A second big point. This is an old political idea. Don't waste a crisis. That's what they say in politics. Don't waste a crisis. The United States is in an existential crisis. We don't even have to say that anymore. We're running out of ways to label the madness of the kind of tyranny that is coming down on us right now. Let's not waste this crisis. And in this field in particular, with the Heritage Foundation moving into the White House, and with all of these people with their brains embedded in this problem, working in the White House and in many, many federal agencies, let's not waste this crisis. That doesn't mean I know exactly what we should do about it. I don't. Third, especially in a teaching sense, and I'm sure you do this in history of science. Debbie, you probably will, roll your eyes. I don't know. But from whence the obsession with humans to classify? Why do we classify? It's part of medicine, I understand that. What's the first thing they do? They take a history with you, of course. And if you're the patient, you get sick and tired of giving them the same damn story. But the obsession with classifying by race is all over this story. And we classify in other fields too, of course, but why here? So much, endlessly. We never stop. This comes, there were so many great talks, and this came from Natalie Lear, the question from Natalie Lear's talk. It was fine that I didn't get to ask it, that's fine. But was this done to the Japanese in the internment? I mean, we've talked a lot about incarceration, we've talked a lot about prisons here, and we should. But, and I have a senior thesis student right now doing an amazing, at least the topic is amazing. He's following a whole extended family from the first couple who met in an internment camp and what's happened to all their family. But was this kind of testing, this kind of biological testing done on the Japanese? It was. Okay, well, I had a hunch. And then our friend from the Post, Nicole, reporter who had to leave, get a train, brought up the idea, I see it, Michelle, brought up the idea of sea changes. And I just wanted to return to that a little bit because I've known a lot of curators and museum exhibition people over the years. I've worked with a lot of museums. I've worked with filmmakers. I mean, good God knows the documentary film world has been transformed, as we learned the other night. But what we learned from this is progress is not always in a direct relation to knowledge. Think about all the documentary films that have been done on race in this country. The great triumph of Eyes on the Prize, and now they're making Eyes 3, have you heard? I mean, incredible documentaries on the history of slavery, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. And yet he got elected again. And lastly, last point, universities. I've been harping on this, you know, when I get my dumb little questions in. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times back about a week or 10 days after the election, and they give them titles. It wasn't my title. Universities need to have a reckoning. Okay, I didn't actually say that, but that's a good title. And the point was that we liberals in universities really have lost touch with society. And elections prove that to us now. I'm not blaming anybody in this room because well, the last session we had was all about community. Damn right. But it's not easy to translate the academy to community. We shouldn't think that that's simple, even though most people in faculty positions at elite universities don't do that. We know that. That's not what they get up every day to do. It's not what they're paid to do, to translate what they do to the world outside. But it's going to take enormous energy. I don't know if we can do it, for universities to gain back the trust we've lost. We are down now in the recent Gallup polling, not quite as low as trust in the Supreme Court, but we're only a little ways above it. Universities are loathed in this country. And here's the irony for me. The one part of trust in universities that's still doing pretty well is medical schools and hospitals. And we've been hearing a lot about why they shouldn't be trusted either. So I don't, that was my one hope in all this Gallup data. And oh my God, and people don't even trust them. So we have a great deal to do. I know something about the leadership of Yale, and the new president is deeply interested in this problem. She knows universities are hated. And she wants to try to understand, how can we present ourselves to the world better? Well, you start in small ways, and then you work from there. And as I've said already here, at the GLC, everything we do, we try to make it for the community as best we can. So those are just some observations.
Okay. Thank you, David. And I just want to pull through, you know, inviting us to think about the distinction between lay understandings of race and more formal ones, and just that takes us to Rana's work about where those lay understandings of race come from. It's not just a we that's floating. There's people that are, you know, institutions, figures, thoughts that's reproduced. Ayah, I'm going to leave the last word with you before we turn to questions. But also because, well, you have since the film on Thursday and across all day, I'm just curious about what you've made of the conversation and where the work needs to go from here.
So I think having us all in this space thinking through these questions together has been extremely productive, and this needs to become more of a feature of the work that we do, is thinking collaboratively and working collaboratively, being engaged with folks working in different spaces, folks working in the community health space, folks working in K through 12 education, that the conversations have to be across all of these things in order for us to really get anywhere. It can't just be, you know, people who like really narrow corners of the history of racial science, myself included, right? So I think that's been the highlight of the weekend for me, is that I've gotten to have these conversations with people that I don't normally get to have them with, and I think we need to create some kind of infrastructure to keep doing that. The other thing that I think, and this is sort of a byproduct of the work that I've been doing on the history of Black folks who are pumped about eugenics, is that there are so many, being sort of enmeshed in what Black folks are writing about in moments of incredible violence, in slavery, enduring lynching, sexual violence, all of these things, that there are so many lessons for us from Black history that are so applicable to the moments what we're dealing with right now. There's a lot of, I feel like, a lot of hemming and hawing about, like, this is, thinking about this moment as somehow unprecedented. But, right, how are you going to tell an enslaved person that tyranny is new? How are you telling Black people after Reconstruction that tyranny is new? Right? How are you telling Black people who endure lynching that tyranny is new? Right? There are so many opportunities for us to leverage the work that has already been done for our benefit in this moment, right? And I think about this especially, one of the chapters that I am writing for my manuscript is looking at Black public health work. And one of the things that has, in the sort of, once I wasn't struggle writing my dissertation, actually got to sit and marinate on the ideas a little bit, that Black folks are identifying the stuff that we're talking about right now 100 years ago. Black people are talking about racism as a public health problem 100 years ago. Black people have laid out health inequality, have laid out ideas about health disparity. Black people have laid out social and behavioral determinants of health 100 years ago, but when we narrate those histories, none of that gets covered, right? And I think that kind of absence and that kind of silence is part of the sort of intellectual problem we're having now with how do we grapple with these things, because our understanding of these histories is incomplete because we're not reading everybody who's involved in those histories. We often talk about things like eugenics and racial science as things that happened to Black people or happened to disabled people or happened to indigenous people. We don't do the reading on the other side of what are people doing in response to these things? How are people engaging these questions? How are people slicing off pieces of this to make arguments that have utility for their own struggles, right? There's a lot of intellectual heavy lifting that that really needs to be done for us to fully grapple with the extent of the problem and also have the conversations that we need to have, right? And I think this kind of deals with the issues of whether or not the university is trustworthy, that people are not going to trust institutions where they don't see themselves, right? People are not going to trust institutions where their experiences and their stories are not told or are relegated to a periphery, right? If we just have, okay, we have the little Black History Month and we put up some posters, but all year round we don't talk about it, then why would these institutions be trustworthy, right? If people don't see their histories as part of those places, especially when they actually are a part of the places that we do this work in. And so I think we have a lot of work to do, but we also, this is a huge opportunity, right? That we all chose to be in this room on a Saturday to do this work, and like, so we need to, part of doing that work is talking to each other and talking to people that we don't normally talk to, but also reading beyond the things that we're used to reading, rethinking what our disciplines are supposed to do, right? Part of one of my many, soapboxes that I stay on, like, we need to rethink what it means to be a historian, right? Being a historian doesn't just mean I go in the archive and I look at old papers and I write stuff and that's the end of the day, right? If I'm not putting my work in conversation with things that are ongoing, then haven't really done my job. I remember one of my professors, at Hopkins, Jessica Marie Johnson, who's a historian of slavery and like incredible, we bask in her glory. In a lab that she had formed, we were talking about how we think about our own work, and she cited Tina Campt talking about, I'm not accountable to the seminar table, I'm accountable to the kitchen table, right? And I think that kind of framework is part of the way we need to reorient our disciplines. If we actually thought we were accountable to the kitchen table, then how does the work we do in the university look different, right? If we think we're only accountable to the seminar table, that fundamentally changes what we do, right? And so rethinking our vision of what the fields are supposed to do, right, versus what they have already done is a huge part of the work. And that rethinking also helps us to open the doors and think more widely about what moments of possibility could look like. So
I think the election showed us we are accountable to the kitchen table.
yeah.
All right, well, Thank you for that, and it also invites everyone to think about the practices that make us accountable to different kitchen tables that we've heard. So we have a few minutes for questions, but I first want to acknowledge not just the incredible work that's shared, but also what we learn when we put the work in conversation. So first, please join me in thanking the fantastic presentation. And we have about 10 minutes before we wrap up. So I think we have one in the back and then one there. Yeah, let's maybe work down the middle.
Hi. I kind of want to expand the conversation about the legacies of eugenic thinking in history and the history of science. I can think of at least 6 scholars in the history of science and technology studies whose most recent project is family planning for women in the third world as a response to the climate catastrophe. And I was just wondering how we can reckon with these legacies, not just because we have been talking so much about it in science and where our responsibilities to the public are, but I also want to talk about how it has become a part of prescriptions by historians. I don't know if anybody wanted to respond to that.
Well, just if you could write that on a Post-it note and just kidding. But I think your sense is right, is that the longevity of things like eugenics is not, I think we sometimes want to relegate that to science, right? And we'll say, well, this is how it looks in, psychometric testing, or this is how things look in genetics, or this is how things look in these places. But there's absolutely a robust legacy of eugenics in humanities and the social sciences, right? And one that needs really deep interrogating, because there's still the colonial logics of those fields are so very much intact, right? The idea, and I've seen folks not just in history sort of make these claims, but I've seen folks who are bioethicists be like, well, part of the ways we get address climate change is ensuring that certain people don't have children, and it's you could do something much more interesting than regurgitating eugenics and neo-Malthusianism from the 1970s. Do better, right? But that there's always this logic about reproductive control, and that reproductive control is always something that has to happen elsewhere, right? I think is something that we have not spent enough time as historians wrestling with how those things continue to exist in the field. I think you're absolutely right, and that I think it warrants a much deeper conversation. And I'm going through my head thinking about this, and I'm thinking of I think we're thinking of some of the same people, but that there's also this way that these ideas continue to have traction for folks who would consider themselves pro-choice, that the solution to so many problems is just people not having children, rather than fixing structure so that people can choose or not to choose not to have the children they don't want to have, right? And that so much of this is foundational to things like reproductive justice movements, but that a lot of folks who would consider themselves pro-choice have not fully grappled with what reproductive justice would look like, and not just the presence or the sort of ability to control childbirth, but giving people access to whether or not they want childbirth, right? And that's a much bigger, much more complicated structural problem that takes a lot more heavy lifting than giving people IUDs, right?
I'll try to make this first point very quickly. It's really a PSA. There is a group that I think is kind of obviously missing from my perspective, at least, that it would have been good to hear from. This thought occurred to me in the previous panel, which was a forward-facing organization in terms of community engagement, and with excellent best practices that I think we all want to walk away with. Similarly, this is a great panel of academicians and all of the great work you're doing. There's a group, though, of Black people engaged in many of these efforts, particularly health inequities, called BDHEA, and I haven't heard any mention of it or even talk about the need for us to be for us to be involved at that level also. These are black directors of on boards of directors of hospitals of different healthcare organizations around the country. BDHEA is Black Directors Health Equity Alliance, and if you Google that, quite a bit of information will pop up. And I'm surprised, just by show of hands, is anyone aware of this group? You're talking over 300 people at their most recent symposium at the Morehouse School of Medicine, where there were 3 black solicitor generals there to present. So doing great work, I would think, but that's for you all to tell us, but you first have to at least know about them. That took too long. I'll yield to the floor if you can get back to me. Otherwise, I'll talk to you after.
Can I respond? Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you for that PSA. I think it's really valuable for all of us. What I can tell you from the work that I've been doing in Los Angeles as well as the work in Maryland, there are several very engaged public health scholars, public health scientists who work for the State Department that have been able to push and move the needle forward on decarceration efforts, on alternatives to incarceration as a public health crisis. A lot of the things that we're learning in our research is that people who are dying in jail or people who are dying in custody, most of them have mental health issues or untreated mental health conditions or are suffering of a health crisis, and we're using law enforcement to solve what are essentially social health crises. And public health administrators know this, and when they step into the game and they get behind local organizations, local activist groups, local abolitionist groups, suddenly boards of supervisors, governors start paying attention a little bit more. And I think one of the missteps perhaps we're seeing now with the HSS appointment of Robert Kennedy Jr. is that there's a backing away of recognizing racism as a public health issue that doesn't just impact those who are immediately impacted, but there's countless studies that show, look, if you live near neighborhoods that are over-policed, even if you're not the direct target of that policing, it affects endocrine systems, it affects your ability to sleep, it affects all of these other collateral things that we aren't thinking about that we should measure, that we can measure, getting back to social structure. So I think until we start having a larger collective discussion about the public dimension of health, which is to say all of our ships are tied together, I don't think we're going to see things change. And we need those directors, we need these elected officials to help push this.
Don, thanks for your question. Just a quick footnote. We did a project here that pretty much just ended, 4 years or 5 years, with Mellon money. We called it the Legacies of Slavery. We did it with liberal arts colleges, but each of them had to choose a legacy. We designed 9 legacies they could choose from, and one was health inequities. It's the college in Shreveport. Was it Centenary College? They have a big like public health program, and we tried to mostly work with small colleges that are not the famous and rich ones. And I think we heard about this from them in their various work and their presentations and so on. But beyond that, I didn't know anything about it until we heard it from them and now from you. So thanks for bringing that up.
We have time for one more question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to first say thank you to everybody on the panel for the outstanding work and contributions, and thank the organizers for all the outstanding panels we've had. I wanted to invite you all to sort of think with me and grapple with me about something that I've been grappling with for the past, I don't know, almost 30 years since I first started going to Evelyn Hammond's scientific racism discussion sections when she used to host them at MIT a long time ago. And it has to do with the actual terms scientific racism and the terms eugenics. Like, in a way, I always felt very uncomfortable with those terms because I think the term scientific racism sections off the explicitly racist parts of science in order to preserve, right, the sanctity of science as a trusted mode of knowledge production. And similarly, with eugenics, it sanctions off the explicitly racist parts of the study of human biology and genetics in order to preserve, right, the larger fields and their sanctity as a trusted mode of knowledge production, and does so without asking, how did these fields, how were they able to coexist with such bad knowledge, right? And not really exploring the fact that when we look at all the inequities that exist, the fields of the human and social sciences were elaborated not to produce truth, but to reproduce a colonial order of the world. And similarly with the university, they were structured as elitist institutions. They weren't trusted to generate trust with the rest of the society. They were elaborated on the idea of reproducing colonial leadership, organization of society, right? And so that pushes us to, I think, some very different questions about how long are we going to keep trying to remodel a burning house? If there are some foundational, structural insufficiencies there that are continually reproducing the social order that we see today, that it's by no accident, right? So I just wanted to, invite you all, right, to be grappling with that larger issue.
Thanks for that very, very provocative and far-reaching question. I think it's a good occasion to ask you to speak to that and offer a kind of a minute or so concluding comment as you like.
Thank you for that. It's a great question. I'm struggling for the right words so that we can end this conference on a positive note, but I don't think I can do that. I've realized in this more recent work that the academy and the university across the board in many ways is gripped by a kind of nihilism, which what I mean by that is, I'll give you just a brief anecdotal example. One of the first pieces I wrote about people dying in custody, I submitted it to a special edition on abolition in medicine for the AMA. And I made very clear links that I just shared with all of you, the connections between slavery, biological determinism, carcerality, and law enforcement, very clear, right? Used autopsies to make the argument. And two responses to that submission, which I, by the way, was asked to submit. I didn't just randomly do this, they asked me to do it. One was, well, you didn't embed it enough in the literature to make this argument. Which the problem with that is, well, the argument is that people are dying for reasons that are preventable, and we don't know about it. That was the intellectual lift of the piece, right? So whether or not the literature validates what I'm saying or not is almost besides the point. But in a way in which it was gatekeeping, and I think that's part of the issue. The other part of it is this idea that they responded, well, our readers are not used to engaging with this type of material, right? So which I said, well, why do a piece on abolition then? Because then otherwise it could just be a regular edition on whatever. So I think we have to do some soul searching in the academy and realize that very often there are social problems that do not require an academic footnote to be real. And I think we have to encourage scholars to follow those things.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take very, very brief. Thank you for that point for that I can take home with me. I think just to stay in character, I mean, I think when I engage questions from junior people, I get a question from kind of junior colleagues and mentees about, is it all just incorrigibly broken, right? Right? Is there no point to thinking about kind of human inheritance at all, or about the science of epidemiology at all, or right? Given all of these forces that we're discussing, given all of the poor outcomes, and in some ways, I think the way I try to respond, in part because I just want them to finish their problem set, but also because I think that is letting it off easy, right? Right. That sort of despair, right? And the notion that it is incurably broken, and this is it actually, despite all that, there's triumphs. There's things that, like, the human condition has improved. Science is really, I think, the greatest knowledge creation instrument the universe has ever seen. We see the signature for that in every community. And so when it does not do its job, it is our imperative to fix it, right? Rather than kind of eternally damn it because of the things that were done. And so that's not a positive or hopeful or jingoistic or at all, right? But it is one where it demands this sort of conversation in order to actually maximize the good and the discovery and the insight, rather than kind of condemn it to eternally condemn it to never being able to do good. So that's my quick take on that.
I want to suggest that's a really wonderful note to conclude our conference. No, it is. It is. It's a way to think about both things together. Please join me in thanking this fantastic panel again.